Hey guys, it's Charles Beasley and welcome to Chat GCP, a medical science, clinical research and commercialization podcast. Today's episode, we're going to talk about all the things tech transfer. So universities are great places to get an education, but they're also good places for the generation of new ideas and new technologies. But how do new ideas and technologies make their way from the academic setting in a university to a commercial entity? We're here to discuss these topics and more as today's guest, Will Charles. Welcome, Will.
Hi. Nice
And
to see
also
you.
fantastic surname, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. So obviously you're working currently, or you're running currently UniServices, particularly in an investment capacity. But I did see in your background that you spent a bit of time at a pharmaceutical, in the pharmaceutical industry as well. So I was curious as to the through line that kind of connects everything between your early experiences to where you are now.
Sure.
Like what's been like the overarching direction that you've been on, or your interest that's been governing these changes?
Okay. Well, so when I did a biology degree, science degree, and physiology, and then but I've always been relatively interested in how you apply science, or how it gets applied into the world, and what can it do. And so, but I was fortunate when I was young, I was introduced to somebody who worked in the pharmaceutical industry. And one of the things they said to me, because I said, what sort of jobs are there? And he said, well, what are you interested in? And I said, well, I'm interested in how it gets transformed into products and services. And he said, well, the best way to do that, to start, is to actually work in sales and be a salesperson. And if you've got so one of the things that being a salesperson teaches you is that when you think about a company, everything that the company does, from the CEO's car park through to everything else, is kind of crystallized in that one moment when you're in front of a customer. And so you can think of that sales perspective. And so everything you're given and every piece of information you're given has to be designed in such a way that your experience as a salesperson with the customer is a pleasant one. Okay. In other words, they're likely to buy from you. Okay. So you learn pretty quickly what kind of works and what doesn't work, because you're crystallized in that one space at the beginning. But then obviously it's a bit more than that. And so what you then do, and I was fortunate in that role, I sort of was quite good at it. So I managed to get myself promoted, and then I moved into market research, and then I went from market research to being a product manager. And product management is a role that's not well taught or well understood here in New Zealand. Generally, which is the concept. It's not just, some people think of marketing as just that kind of advertising piece, but product management is fundamentally identifying that product market fit, delivering a product or a service that actually suits that customer. And so that was a great learning education. I mean, in terms of a business degree, I was very fortunate. I was 24, and I'd had this amazing real life education. But then I decided that actually I wanted to sort of branch out a little bit more and think about more sort of corporate type business development and how things worked. And so I left, and also it was a really exciting time because it was the start of the biotech.
Okay.
So I went to work for a company called Celtech, and Celtech were had some early stage of monoclonal antibody development. And one of the jobs I had there was we were effectively a contract manufacturing. One of the things that Celtech did, it had its own drug pipeline and so on. But one of the things it did was it sold contract manufacturing for monoclonal antibodies.
Yeah.
And what that gave you an insight is to a different form of how you then get a drug thing, because you just used to think about it as clinical trials, but one forgets that behind all of that, there's all of this regulation and what you have to do in order to actually deliver a product or a biological product. So again, that was another piece of that puzzle. But within that job as well, the company had a bunch of patents. And the question really was, how do we monetize some of those patents? And the way you do that, obviously, and the thing is you license those. Right? So we had a number of manufacturing patents that would enable you to make monoclonal antibodies, but have a yield out of the same sort of sized cylinder that was about tenfold. So obviously that brings down the cost of goods significantly. And so we didn't really know what we were doing. So we had a simple license agreement that said it's $50,000 US up front, just as a payment.
Yep.
And then we sort of just put a throwaway thing in there. So if you make any of your drugs and they get to market, there's a 1% trailing royalty on it. And so then I left, and I discovered subsequently later on that 10 years later after I'd left that some of these royalties were now coming through because some of the largest, biggest pharmaceuticals are monoclonal antibodies.
Yeah.
So this money track was just reversing back in and dumping money every year into this thing. Anyway, by then I'd moved.
So you didn't get the benefit of
No, I
those
didn't actually get
royalties?
the benefit. But one of the things, because actually I was living in the UK then, and I was actually brought up in East Africa, so I didn't really feel at home in the UK.
Yeah.
So I was looking for somewhere else to live, and my wife's English, but she didn't want to live in East Africa. She found it a bit intense. And so I got offered a job here in New Zealand. What I was doing here was I worked in medical publishing. Again, it was really the concept of intellectual property. So I was responsible for a suite of medical journals at the time. But it was also really, if you think about from a commercialization point of view, this was in the early 90s. It was a really interesting time to be in the commercialization of information, right? Because you were moving from a print environment and a subscription environment and a business model which said, you pay us in November the previous year for the whole year next year, and you're paying for whatever we give you.
Yeah.
Okay. And you'll just get everything.
Just get it.
You get everything, you just get it. To the internet, which said, actually, I can choose exactly what I want, and I'll only pay you when I've decided exactly what I want. Yes. So you can imagine as a commercialization and thinking about a business model, that was quite an interesting time to be in publishing. And that was really fun because you were just trying things. I mean, remember do you remember things called FTP sites, right? This was kind of like the emergence of the web. And so that was really fun. Then I had a life-changing thing when my son, I've got 2 children. My son was, so I was traveling around the world with my publishing job, and I thought, well, that was fun. And then I had my son born very prematurely, so I couldn't travel. And so I had to stop doing that. And so I then thought, well, kind of go back to my roots. So I went and I got a job as the national sales manager for SmithKline Beecham here in New Zealand. And then again, I got lucky and we went through a merger with GSK, and I ended up running the asthma franchise for them. And then I then moved to Novartis, worked there in New Zealand, and then latterly I worked in South Korea, running a business unit up there. And but then I thought, well, it was a weird thing to do to emigrate to a country and then not live there. And my children were kind of going through a stage where I didn't really want them to become expat children. And so I thought, well, let's go home. So I came back here. And I thought, well, what's the good, so I was always sort of looking around for a job. And there's always an element of luck, right? So UniServices, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of the university, was looking for a head of commercialization to in those days was really just to take patents, to look at IP that the university was generating and license it to companies or startups that were coming out of the university or that were emerging outside the university. And so that's what it is. So it was kind of luck that this job existed, which was enabling me to kind of, if I thought about it, put all the elements of my career into thinking about, well, how could you do that? So it included licensing, it included sales, it included business development.
Yes.
All of those bits and pieces. So that's how I ended up in it.
Yeah, that's a good story and a nice history. But you really saw the whole beginning to end. So like manufacturing, licensing, business development, sales, IP protection.
So at each stage of my career, I've been fortunate in that I've dealt with all of the different pieces.
You're tacking on additional skills.
And I think, if I was talking to somebody, I'd still give the same advice to anybody who was thinking about a career in the commercialization of science, or engineering, whatever it is, at some stage. And companies have graduate programs now where you get to different places and whatever. I would always tell somebody at some stage in your career, have a job that it requires you to interface very closely with the customer. And also the other thing is, if you're in sales with a customer, people are polite, right? But they don't. That people will say nice things. That's completely different to opening their wallet and paying you, right?
For sure.
So I think one of the things that we talk about in market validation is, you've got to remember the polite factor, and that's particularly true in anything clinical. I mean, doctors are terribly polite, right? terribly polite. They'll say, well, that's a good idea. But as soon as you say, well, if it's such a good idea, you want to invest in it. Oh, no.
Yeah, indeed. So UniServices initially started up for out licensing.
Well, it initially started out for doing all sorts of, well, it initially started out as for ways in which industry could buy consulting and contract research from the university. And then it sort of moved into licensing sort of in the late 1980s and early 90s. I should have sort of add the sort of global, I mean, universities have been licensing IP for a long time over in the US and so on. But if you look at how industry has changed in the last sort of 30, 40 years, is traditionally they would have a lot of their own R&D. So there used to be, in the States, used to be big corporate labs, right? And they would have fully integrated R&D right from, discovery through to product launch. And it was around about the turn of the century, started by, I mean, the pharmaceutical industry has been doing a little because there was obviously the biotech industry in the late 80s, and the pharma industry started to look to biotech for some of its innovation. But more generally, Procter & Gamble started it by, there's a guy who invented a thing called open innovation. And that was kind of like a realization that you couldn't hire all the smartest people in the world. So you had to actually engage with the universities because that's where quite a lot of smart people were working. But it was purely, you took those results or you took the IP and you still put it into your vertically integrated R&D system. What happened when the GFC happened was effectively they cut all of there was a lot of cutting of R&D. Now what filled that gap, it was globally filled that gap, was venture capital and startup ecosystems to a point where, we were selling one of our startups to a large global corporate, and we just asked the question, how many of these do you do a year? And they said, well, we buy a company like this, we probably buy 3 a week, all right? So so innovate. So what you had to do. So what's evolved in my role is I've done this thing from purely being an IP seller, if you like. Some people call it an IP troll. You say, you're infringing. If you want to use this, you pay me. It's kind of like standing over them with a big hammer. To a realization that if a university wants to engage both with its local and international community, you've got to have a healthy startup ecosystem. So it's really evolved from being one of just selling IP to being an enabler of ideas, IP, people, and capital to kind of coalesce together in an environment where knowledge is being created and people are being trained, whether they think they're being trained or not, they're being trained. And where it's a relatively safe community, like a university is a safe place, because you can do things in an extracurricular activity and there's not, it's not life-threatening, it's not life-changing. If one of your ideas when you're 19 or 20 fails, you've still got 50 years to make up for it, right? It's not catastrophic. So there's safe environments to do that. And if you look that's effectively what's happened around, if you look at it, you break it down, that's Stanford in Silicon Valley. It's MIT in Boston, but increasingly it's all of these different places. And so if you're a modern university and you want to engage, you want to engage with your community, you have to, think about having a healthy startup ecosystem that you contribute to.
A lot of these places, they have their own kind of particular flavor, right? I mean, Silicon Valley has their own particular startup flavor around them. MIT around them is very like biotech focused and pharmaceutical development focused. And I feel like there's a preponderance of medical technology companies around in the startup ecosystem in
I think it tends to depend. Lots of it comes from your place, right? So, and what your university. So I think Silicon Valley is unique. So I sort of look at it and you go, well, that has some, but fundamentally that's Silicon. That's what's called Silicon Valley, right? So that's really the kind of so that's fine. But Boston was kind of where there's quite a lot of. I mean, there's Boston, but there's also Raleigh-Durham around. So. Tends to be often where there's the university, but it's proximity to good hospitals, for example, and proximity to also to where the industry is too. I think in New Zealand we've got a history here, a little bit of a history, but also it tells you about what that actually university is really good at.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So the University of Auckland, very fortunate here, we've got one of the world's leading bioengineering institutes. And led by Professor Peter Hunter, who's kind of like a giant in the in the bioengineering one. And bioengineering, effectively, medical devices are a bioengineering construct, and that's how it kind of evolved. So that's one of the reasons why. But it's not the only thing that had in it. But it tends to be, my view is, you can't pick winners, right? Nobody comes in and says deliberately do that. You've got to be able to recognise really high quality and then surround that quickly and give that support that it needs. So at the moment, we've got very high quality research in bioengineering and also in the clinical development of those. So that's what we're exploiting.
Yes.
In the past, the university's been very strong in power electronics, for example. So in wireless power transfer, if you think about the University of Auckland's contribution to the iPhone, for example, is first of all, in the 1960s, and the company still exists, called Buckley Systems, and they were involved in one of the first companies that made magnets that enabled you to etch silicon, so you could then make silicon chips, right, without having to do it chemically.
Yeah.
Okay, that was in the 60s. Then in the 1990s, if you wanted to automate the manufacture of silicon chips in a factory, if you wanted to move them around, you couldn't have any kind of machinery that could produce sparks. So any electrical contact produced sparks. So if you wanted to move anything, you meant you had to have a human pushing it around. Right? Okay, and so again, wireless power came from the University of Auckland, wireless power transfer. That now operates in about 90% of the world's clean rooms. It's old technology, so we don't get any royalties from it, but 90% of the world's clean rooms use technology that was discovered at Auckland. Yeah. And what did that do? It made the things cheap, which is why we can all afford these things now, right?
Yes.
And then later on, that then evolved into through the kind of spin-out ecosystem. A company called Power by Proxy came as bright student Paddy Mishriki, took that wireless power to the next level by reducing it in size and power, put it into consumer devices. Apple purchased Power by Proxy. So if you've got an Apple phone or you've got an Apple Pen, every time you put it on a wireless charger, that technology came from Auckland.
Is that right? Yeah.
So now that wasn't a deliberate thing. So I talked about biomedicine today, but in the past there's been other areas, and that was fundamentally based on fundamentally world-class research, really leading edge stuff.
Yeah, because there's a company, Katea Health, that have their wireless powered sensor.
That's right.
And I'm sure that's building on that technology.
Building on that technology. So the next step obviously is, how do you then make it into an environment where it has to be proven safe and all the regulations that go alongside that. So there is Katea Health. At the same time, the wireless power, again, that led to what do they call themselves? But before Katea Health, there was a company making wireless animal sensors for animal research. So it's a smaller company.
Like telemetry?
Telemetry research. Sorry, it was telemetry research.
Yeah, it's all interlinked. So kind of going back to the whole purpose of UniServices is to exploit, which is
it's not really exploit. I think the word,
I think leverage, shall we say?
I wouldn't even call it leverage. What we're part of, we're trying in the university to get to sort of end. If you think about universities, traditionally they produce graduates, postgraduates, and they publish papers, and people then buy research for. So that's part of the sort of pyramid, if you like. But that kind of concept of industry engagement and spin-out companies is kind of like the top of the pyramid, where you're trying to do the kind of third mission, if you like.
Yeah.
And what we're trying to do is not really, we use the word, it's actually to provide an end-to-end solution for any staff member or any student to undertake so if it's a student, to think about undertaking an entrepreneurial journey. Yeah. From no idea is a bad idea through to a well-financed company leaves the university, or a member of staff to think about, and again, they're students too, but a member of staff to think about commercialization as one route, because there are a number of different routes, one route to impact of the research they've done. And so it's not just UniServices doing part of this. Our role comes a little bit. So if you think about that journey from no idea is a bad idea, you've got to create awareness, you've got to create inspiration, you've got to create places where people can listen and understand and learn. And then once they've got an idea to do the sort of first help of developing it. But once it requires resources like money, then you've got to then have some funds and things that enable it to be pulled along, because there is a point at which you want to hand it over to the private sector. There's no point in a university handing it over. So it's like an evolving. So what I call it more like an ecosystem, right? And what is our role? So we're part of that end-to-end system. And on the university campus, we work very closely with our research office, so that tells us who's doing a lot of research. But we also work with the Centre of Innovation and Entrepreneurship, because that's a place where you can get curricular and extracurricular learning opportunities about entrepreneurship, doing all of the things I described to you, market validation, whatever that, will take you 6 or 7 years to get in a job, but hopefully by just having a bit of awareness of it, you might learn that earlier. And then we work very closely at that kind of, so once the venture or think that something's starting to be formed, and particularly if it's technical, that's where our skills come in, because we understand IP, we understand science, we understand what's good. And then we provide the kind of funding and the connectivity and the networks towards that end state. So I don't think of it as exploiting or thing. It's a service offering that we can make some money out of, for from both the outside world, which is investors who want they want well-run companies that are likely to have a chance of making some money, and at the other end we've got this group of really talented people, some of whom will end up on a kind of startup or commercialization journey.
Yeah. Here's a quick message from today's sponsor, SAPPro, your clinical trial pathway partner. Engaging with SAPPro as your clinical trial pathway partner will keep you and your collaborators on track, ensuring your strategic objectives are met and that your product is approved as soon as possible. For the small biotech or pharmaceutical company, SAPPro offers tailored CRO solutions from start to finish with their reliable alliance partners. From my perspective, I did my university career 2009, 2013, the BSc, Masters of Bioscience Enterprise. So I became an adult right around the GFC, which was really fun. And then you just see like the shrinking of the availability of biotech roles or pharmaceutical roles in New Zealand. And since my graduation, I feel as though it's just rocketed up. Like there's a lot more happening because of this nurturing of the ecosystem. I said to Diana Hugh because I had her on the podcast, I said, man, I wish I was that same 23-year-old kid now instead of being 23 in 2013. Because just talk about the promise of youth when you've got all of this laid out in front of you. So it's so inspiring. But part of what UniServices does is you have these committees that provide the expertise or the early look into kind of bench test or stress test ideas and concepts. So there's the momentum committees, which
so
those are the
there's a whole bunch of committees. So one of the things that when I first started this, there's lots of armchair critics of commercialization, all that kind of stuff. That's cool, when you but the good thing about critics is they make you think, right? And they make you improve.
Yeah.
So it's quite a good way of thinking about it, I think. Anyway, one of the criticisms of what universities or people, and you still hear it, people say it today, is there's all this IP gathering dust on the shelves in these universities, which I always thought was an interesting thing to say, because most IP is in people's heads. And most IP leaves the building because you employ them. So, it's not gathering dust on our shelf. It might be gathering dust if you're not exploiting their talent. It's in your shelves. But anyway, that's beside the point. But one of the things was people would say, well, why don't you have a database of all the IP you've got? And I used to say, well, I could try that, and I could do that. But what having a database, and you see governments try it all the time. We'll put a database together of all of the, and what ends up happening is somebody's got to stop what they're doing, stop their day job to fill a database, and on the other side, somebody has to stop their day job and look at a database, right? And so, which means neither happens, and so they're always out of date, they're always incomplete, and their usefulness is kind of incidental, right? So I said, rather than doing that, I will make my workflow open, right? Now, if you have a fund or you do any kind of investing, you need an investment committee. And in an investment committee, you need experts who understand the area you're living in, whether something's good, understand all that kind of stuff. And so we put together an investment committee, because I had to do it because they've had a fund. And then I said, well, we'll make them open. So an open insofar as you can sign a one-page confidentiality agreement which says anything you hear or see at the meeting, you don't talk about. But if you're interested in it, come talk to us and we can then do everything, sensibly. And so what that is the idea is it's because they're anchored in time. If anybody says to me, well, there's all this stuff gathering dust on the shelf, you can say, well, anything we know about that we're making a decision about in workflow, you can listen to or watch. You don't even have to turn up. You can just come on Zoom.
Yeah.
Now, we had these committees, and then what happens is we started with one. And of course, what happens is you have a biotech project, and all the engineers start sleeping, and vice versa. And the engineers see a biology thing, and engineers hate the error bars on graphs. What's that error bar? Well, it's biology. No, it's not.
Yeah.
It's not accurate. So anyway, you get this kind of thing. So you have to then get some specialization. And then what happened was you got to a point where we've still got 5 specialist committees. The challenge we had was we were losing contact with students because everybody looked like me, right? So. And who wants to hang out?
What's wrong with that, Will?
Nothing, right? So nobody wants to come and spend a whole bunch of time with somebody who looks, white, stale. So what we did was we went down to the student community and asked them to join. Got an amazing, because again we're involved in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. People knew who we were. We were able to get those students in. They made such a big difference to the way in which committees were run, the way we gave feedback, how we welcomed people. All that stuff. That was so fantastic. We said, well, why don't we give students their own committees? And so we said, well, you can't do that. And I said, well, the great thing about a university is they're safe places. Who said we can't? Who said you can't, right?
Yeah.
So we gave these so they're now called Momentum Investment Committees, and they're national, so they're in all the main centres in New Zealand. And they represent the region rather than the university, but they're typically people from the university. So Otago's is, Dunedin's is Otago's, right? Yes. But it also... we've had things there from Otago Poly and things like that, right? But what that is designed to do is not just it's actually designed to give some experiential learning, and I'm a great believer in experiential learning on campus. Not just for the entrepreneurs, because that's done by the Centre of Innovation or Centres of Innovation and Entrepreneurship, and all universities have some in some shape or form. But it's also training the next generation of people who are going to say, well, think about capital planning. Does that business plan make sense? Are those the right milestones? Does this team look like it's a team that can do what they say they're going to do?
Yeah. And
so that's the point of that. But it's also giving a kind of concept of peer. You're trying to do peers on each part of it. So we're quite proud of Momentum. It's quite a neat program, and we see where people have gone from it.
Because you're really priming the pipeline of future entrepreneurs, right?
Because ultimately it's a people business, right? Yeah. One of the things it's easy to forget, and one of the things that you say here, I hear people talk about the IP, the capital, the thing, right? Rather than thinking this is a human endeavor.
Yeah.
And so people capital is kind of, I think the biggest opportunity to make the biggest difference is to do all of that stuff about awareness, but give them an idea, and then provide them with an environment where the mistakes they make, at least in the early stage, aren't too catastrophic.
So the Momentum ones, so they're student-led, represent the region, a lot of room for error because you're still a student.
Absolutely.
Is it theoretical, the approach? So obviously nothing gets baked into decision-making for that idea?
No. They actually apply, they have just as much... So they have just as much recommendation power as the specialist committees. So if my Momentum committee says, project came here, they asked for $50,000, we think you should invest $50,000, I can do it.
Yeah.
So they've got authority to approve.
Oh, so they review the same submissions as the specialist committees.
And even if they don't do the specialist ones and they're just student projects, we can give them some funding. So some of the projects that have come through that, there's Vix, there's the coolest one I think is the cauliflower ice cream down in Palmerston North. I can't remember what it's called. But
I've heard of cauliflower pizza, but not
this is
cauliflower ice cream.
Cauliflower ice cream, but I think it is sold in Hell's Pizza. That's probably
really?
Yeah. So so there is I'm really proud of that one because I mean, you go, well, that might have happened anyway, but we helped.
Oh, for sure. And the people the students that were involved in the review of that and discussing it would have learned a heck of a lot along the way. Yeah.
Well, also, there's a whole community now rooting for them.
Yeah. Yeah. So why don't we talk about some of the highlights of these activities and maybe some successes with spin-outs or big funding milestones or companies. Obviously, some of the stuff will be highly confidential, but others are public.
Yeah,
so.
I tend not to think too much about celebrating success because you have to take a Chinese view of the world, which is we were great for 5,000 years. We've just had about bad 180, and you have to also be a little bit humble around. It's often too early to tell because what does actually success mean? And we have had some successes. We've made money. We've had some companies that have exited, some of which, of course, we can't talk about. But we've got what I'm most proud of is I think the number of companies, particularly you've described medtech, that have a chance of being. So our job really is to set them up with good foundations, and then we are left to the winds of fortune a little bit as to how that thing. So, you could say I'm very proud of Ep19, for example, which is an emerging company, but it's really early to tell. Mm-hmm. Is that going to become a $1 billion company? I think it's got a chance of becoming one. And do I celebrate the success? But I also don't want to hex anything because I've always been proud of the success, and these things do fail. So I look at it from the perspective not just of. So obviously, we've made good financial returns. That's what I'm proud of, is we haven't lost money and we've made money. I'm perhaps most proud of the people who have been touched by the ecosystem, even if they haven't actually been in a startup that's had that. Because, you look at quite a lot of startup companies around the world, the average age of the founders of those is not in their 20s, it's in their 40s.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, and I've given you a slightly dodgy answer, I think, from you wanted to here's some things I want to rah-rah, but actually that's really not what it's about. It's really about an ecosystem that it gives somebody that opportunity and that concept of doing it at some stage. So that's what I would say. So that's really what and then just seeing where people have gone who've been through some of the journeys, and even if somebody goes through some of these things and has a fantastic success at a big company, for me that's just as valuable as somebody who went out and spin out company and it got sold.
Right. Yeah, because the human capital piece is vital for thriving ecosystems like this, right? If you don't have skilled people or somewhere to deploy them or somewhere to learn the skills at low risk or somewhere to grow their skills for the next opportunity, it's just going to be a temporary endeavor, right?
And it's actually the key challenge for New Zealand, right? If you think about...
I mean, the pull to take you overseas, because there's going to be places that might reward your...
Well, reward that, but also, I think we have a little bit of a problem. You can see it on our own stock market, and our big end of town is either banks, regulated industries, or monopolies. Mm-hmm. And so in that kind of environment, it's very difficult to go out as a young person and develop innovative skills in competitive marketplaces, because when you work for those companies, your job really is not to change the status quo. It's not to fiddle with anything. It's about applying your intellectual capability to gaming the system or working out how you get whack and all that stuff. It's not about innovation, right? So that's a challenge for New Zealand because we have very poor innovation. That's why our productivity is low. So if you're a university in that environment, you have to have the risk that you're training people a lot of people who will go overseas, but they'll probably go anyway. But so our challenge is actually human capital, and because it's hard for them to get those experiential things. So we do have a responsibility to run things like, the Master of Bioscience Enterprise course, I think, was one of the first or second in the world, right? So we have to have these kind of things where you do have to replace what I was fortunate enough in a large market to go and learn.
Yes, yeah. And also have like a long-term view of things, right? It's not going to change overnight, growing those skill sets or those capabilities or an ecosystem. Yeah. It's going to take 5-10 years. When did the Bioscience Enterprise...
in 2004 started. So it's been going, nearly 15 years.
Jeez,
and you think about where some of the alumni have ended up, it's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I would also add is I think yourself as you're a biology graduate, right?
And an MBE graduate as
and
well.
an MBE as well. So that's a fantastic program. If you think about a couple of things, New Zealand's a biological economy. So for me, it's about stretching your imagination about how that can be applied. And the other thing to say is that in the future problems of the world, in the main, are going to have either biology at the core or as a significant part of solving.
Right.
So I think it's a really exciting time to be a biologist who thinks about how you can apply that knowledge to providing solutions that people will want to buy.
Absolutely. And there's always going to be problems.
Of course,
We're always
it's
going
biology,
to need
right?
solutions. Yeah, exactly. It's had how many billions of years to evolve to what
That's
it is
right.
now and be
Yeah,
as
that's right.
complex as it is. Yeah. And how can people get involved if they're interested in those return on science? Return on science is the
Return on
specialist
Science
committee.
is the specialist committees and Momentum's on it.
Momentum.
They're all on the website. Just go and Google
Yeah.
Return on Science, and you can Google Momentum.
Sign that one pager and away
Momentum
you go.
and you can just come along.
Yeah.
We'd love you to come along. I think if I was talking to the student community around this, get involved in your innovation and entrepreneurship. Every campus has something. It's usually in the business school, probably the best place for it.
Yeah.
But if you're sitting there thinking about your career, thinking about giving yourself a T-shaped education, it's quite a good idea.
Okay. T-shaped education.
In other words, not just being completely focused on your specialization and
Right.
saying, I'm going to be a microbiologist, but thinking about other skill sets that are going to be useful for you, even if that's just debate club or something else, right? Because it just makes you, I think, interesting. It gives you a perspective that's a bit different to just, I'm a microbiologist.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think the I&E piece, entrepreneurship and innovation, or entrepreneurship particularly, isn't about, that's the other thing, is it's a slightly pejorative word sometimes in New Zealand, right? People think it's fly-by-night cowboys going to, Hanover finance us and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Which isn't the case. What it is about problem solving, working in teams, dealing with stress, looking at opportunities, all of those kinds of things, which are useful in any endeavor.
Absolutely. Yeah. Prior to my current role, I used to work at Novartis. And I spent some time, I was a regional study manager, so I looked after Asia Pacific, and we did a few, I did one large phase 3 study and a couple other smaller ones. And prior to that, I was working at a much smaller company. So I thought, I'll give the big pharma play a try, see what's behind the curtain of big industry. Novartis being, one of the biggest pharma companies in the world. And maybe it's a personality thing, but I was utterly bored to sobs in such a large company because, like what you said, you're there to use your intellectual power to solve increasingly smaller and smaller issues or problems or commit a process, and some people love that. And for me, I just could not handle it. It was, like I said, bored to sob, doing the same thing more or less over and over and again. And I was talking to a friend of mine, and he was like, well, the reason why that is because they've got such a massive headcount that they can afford to occupy smaller and smaller segments of the overarching process. And that's really good for consistency, but it's not very good for creativity because there's no room to be creative. So I often think, like, if I had the opportunity to try start my career over again, I would want to have that smaller company experience. So you can pick up on different things. You can interface with people in different, divisions or disciplines and absorb that, or just even sit in meetings that you wouldn't get in a big company, just to pull it in. So that would be ideal for me. But you can go even further back, earlier, and with these momentum committees.
But what I would also say is that I think it's, I always have these discussions, and we end up these things are never binary. I think one of the challenges that we face in New Zealand a little bit is if you go to the US, for example, we have a lot of people and a lot of training which very generous, so we think we can do everything. But at some stage, it's definitely worth valuing mastery. All right, mastery of something. Now, the environment you picked was because you were in the wrong. You never wanted to be a master of clinical trials, right? You never wanted to be a master of that. you never wanted to be well, I never really wanted to be a master of sales. Right? But if you go to big markets where there are big companies, and you go to the States, somebody who does the job that you did for Novartis really well, and there is a difference. It's not they're not robotic positions, right? There are people who are good at it, and there are people who are rubbish at it, right? And actually, there's an 80-20 principle in all of that stuff. But mastery is truly valued as well. So the trick in thinking about a lot of this stuff is, and it's quite good, you reach a kind of nirvana is when you've got something you really enjoy and you can master it. Okay, so the concept of mastery and if you think that's like, surgeon, things that you go from unconsciously incompetent to unconsciously competent. You have to go through consciously incompetent first, then you have to go through competent, and then you have to go through unconsciously competent. In other words, you just do it without thinking. Right. So I think there's a combination of things that we need to kind of value as a value set, because I think part of our challenge of our company scaling up is somebody who's run a sales force of 10 people is completely different to running a sales force of 5,000. Right. The scale and the things you have to worry about, things you have to think, the processes you need to put in place are so much more detailed and complex that sometimes and so I think we should always remember to have that kind of concept of both.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, I feel like it's an infinite game, that mastery thing, or there's a bit of imposter syndrome that's always lurking in the background. At least I feel that with every new layer that you ascend, or every new competency that you acquire, or every new kind of audience that you have, there's always that thing in the background being like, yeah, they're going to find out soon enough, man, that you don't have the chops. But what I really quite enjoy the infinite side of it. There's not going to be a defined point for me at which I'm like, I've made it, I can rest on my laurels, and here we are. Whereas I think in some of those bigger companies, there is a defined point, because you're there to do that role and just bloody do it. You're going to get better and better and better at it, but your capacity isn't increasing.
No. And for some people that's fine.
Totally. Yeah.
I think it's I think sometimes we should value mastery perhaps more than we do.
Yeah, interesting. All right, well, what's next on the cards for you for this year? What's any new big programs coming out of the university?
Well, I think sort of taking a broader view, right? There's always an opportunity, because I think the kind of concept of an entrepreneurial university, and if you look at places that are reinventing themselves, or reinventing their economic environment, often have some kind of tertiary education institute as part of that, right? Principally because of the people it produces. But I'm really excited about the concept of how can we utilise New Zealand's universities to kind of create a more moving from a number 8 type mentality of entrepreneurship, which is fantastic, don't get me wrong, but one that actually has a little bit more underpinning. So you've actually got a little bit more mastery. So it's not just using wire and fixing it. It's actually thinking about really being clever. So, things like Rocket Lab don't happen because it was a number 8 mentality. There are some patents in there. There's some really smart engineering that's gone into that company. And the founder is the founder. That's fantastic. But underneath them, there's all these people who've also had that kind of environment. And similarly, so I think, it's actually to try and build that ecosystem to make it so that it's a kind of like a national ecosystem. So joining up some of the universities to work together on having entrepreneurial ecosystems on campus that can start to create more impact from the amount the government spends or invests in R&D.
Yeah. So it's a bit like inter-university collaboration, but also maybe some specialization. So there'll be a flavour out of Auckland, a lot of that.
Different flavours, yeah.
I know Otago have theirs, and then
Sorry. Oh, that's bad.
It's all right. waking up anyone that's listening to me drone on. And then, so like Victoria, they're in close proximity to the Malaghan Institute, and they have their thing. And there's another institute down there.
The Robinson Institute. So they've got, absolutely. So they've got a lot of, so there's a lot of smart stuff. It's just about then, because, you don't compete if you're thinking about entrepreneurial ecosystems. It's actually just, and also leveraging scale. So I'm quite excited about, the good thing about Auckland is, which is part of, sometimes what the rest of the country hates us, but we have scale and you can leverage scale. It's much harder to leverage smallness, right? It's easier to leverage scale, and we can help, and we've already demonstrated that. So other universities, for Targa, for example, we work very closely through return on science and momentum. And we built up some programs where it's not a big brother coming to tell you what to do. It's just providing an enabling environment. And because we're big, we can provide the back office stuff, but it's local. That was all local. We want to keep it local. We don't want to, so it's about being local, but leveraging scale.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I find this stuff really, really fascinating. And I spent it maybe 5 years ago. I was quite down on opportunities within New Zealand, and I really feel like, especially exposing, celebrating all the cool stuff that's doing with this podcast, has got me really, really excited. Obviously, I'm not participating in it right now, aside from talking to people like yourself, because my role is with a Melbourne-based company. But it's so cool to see, and New Zealand is a great place. A lot of smart people, a lot of curious people, a lot of interesting people, and we've got a full-on ecosystem that's growing every day. So,
well, I think the other thing to say, celebrate, right, is because who would have thought, so when I was starting, I've done a degree in biology. Who would have said, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to do podcasts. I mean, that you were just a journalist, right? But you think about what's been your own journey and how, doing the MBA has given you the thought process. And let's not underestimate the value of science communication, because, you saw how important it is, but how it can go wrong real quick, in an environment like, COVID. And science communication is going to become increasingly important, because the concept of social license has never been more important.
Well, the language of science doesn't make much sense to most people, and you can't push it through a screen of like normal communication to make it make sense, and then it gets misconstrued, and it's so
misused.
So, absolutely,
all of that stuff.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for joining me. If people want to find out more about yourself or UniServices, where can they go?
Just go to the website, uniservices.co.nz.
Too easy. Love it. Thanks, Will.
No worries.